What if I told you the 308 V8 engine was so good, GM shut it down? This is the shocking truth behind Holden's banned 308 V8 engine, a story of innovation, betrayal, and boardroom sabotage. The EFI Holden V8 engine was ahead of its time, efficient and powerful. The Holden V8 race engine proved itself on track, beating international rivals. But just as it neared world-class status, GM pulled the plug. Why? Because it threatened their global power structure. Discover why the banned 308 V8 engine was buried. Don't forget to like and follow Classic Car Archive for the next episode. A homegrown V8 built from necessity. In the late 1960s, Australia's car market stood apart, cut off from global supply chains, yet driven by a strong sense of independence. While American muscle roared across U.S. highways, Holden faced a much tougher reality. General Motors had plenty of V8s in its arsenal, but importing them to Australia wasn't just costly, it was nearly impossible. Harsh import tariffs meant bringing in fully built engines from the U.S. would crush any chance of competitive pricing. Just the shipping costs from Detroit made the idea financially reckless. But this was about more than money. It exposed how little GM valued its Australian branch. Unlike Chevrolet, Holden didn't get blank checks or corporate favors. So when Holden engineers asked permission to build their own V8, GM gave a half-hearted yes and offered virtually no help. The message was clear. Fine, build it, but you're on your own. Left with a fraction of the funding that U.S. divisions enjoyed, Holden's engineers set out on what many thought was an impossible mission. But they weren't chasing luxury or prestige. They were building out of sheer necessity. The result was a 308 cubic inch V8 launched in the HT Holden in 1969. It wasn't just a locally made engine. It was a triumph of clever, resourceful engineering born from the need to survive in a tough, isolated market. Engineering brilliance under pressure. With a shoestring budget and minimal corporate backing, Holden's engineers had no choice but to innovate under pressure. They couldn't afford cutting-edge equipment or expensive materials, so they made the most of what they had. Instead of chasing complexity, they simplified smartly. The 308's block design was purpose-built for durability and ease of manufacturing, eliminating anything unnecessary. They used a thin-wall casting technique that not only cut weight, but preserved strength. No small feat with outdated tools. The same resourcefulness extended to cooling. Australian conditions were brutal, and unlike US V8s, the 308 had to withstand the harsh, sweltering outback. Engineers designed larger water jackets and optimized coolant flow dynamics that kept the engine cool and composed even when pushed to its limits. The real test came at Mount Panorama, when Peter Brock powered his Holden to victory at Bathurst in a 308-powered Torana. It wasn't just a win, it was proof. An engine born from constraint had just beaten the best on one of the toughest circuits in the world. This wasn't supposed to happen. The 308 wasn't meant to outperform engines built with far bigger budgets and support, but it did. As racing victories piled up, the 308 grew beyond its mechanical roots, becoming a symbol of what the Aussie engineering could achieve when pushed to the edge. Its deep, rumbling exhaust note became iconic, instantly recognizable. A 308-powered Holden wasn't just a car, it was national pride on wheels. By the mid-1970s, the engine's potential was undeniable. Experimental versions with cross-flow heads brought major gains in both power and efficiency. Aluminum components promised to trim weight even further. At this point, the 308 wasn't just impressive for an Australian engine, it was threatening to become world-class. But just as Holden's engineers stood on the edge of a breakthrough, the rug was pulled out. Overnight, everything stopped. No more testing, no more development. What could have been a global contender was shut down. Not because it failed, but because it was too good. Why would GM kill their most promising project? The answer wasn't in the lab. It was in the boardroom. The day Detroit pulled the plug. On the morning of Monday, November 3, 1975, Holdens' engineering team walked into work expecting another day of progress on their world-class 308 V8 project. Instead, they were met by security guards stationed at the engine lab. Test mules were being loaded onto trucks. Access was revoked. Development was over. No warning, no discussion. Just a cold shutdown. The official explanation handed down was resource reallocation. But recently declassified GM memos paint a far more troubling picture. A confidential report dated October 29, 1975 from GM's North American Operations Committee delivered the verdict: Holdens' 308 cubic inch V8 had exceeded performance parameters established for non-premium brand engines. Translation: the Aussie team had built something too good, something that threatened GM's rigid brand hierarchy. In secret tests at GM's Milford Proving Grounds, an advanced version of the engine, shipped quietly to the US, produced 380 horsepower, all while complying with upcoming emission standards. That put it uncomfortably close to Corvette territory. There will be no Australian V8 outperforming a Corvette, period, wrote John DeLorean in a scathing internal memo. The hierarchy must be maintained, regardless of technical merit. And that hierarchy was ironclad. At the top, Cadillac and Corvette. Beneath them, Pontiac's performance line, Oldsmobile, Chevrolet, then Buick. At the very bottom, Holden, alongside Vauxhall and Opel. Just one day after that memo on October 30th, 1975, Holden's chief engineer presented the Crossflow Head 308 development timeline at GM's Global Powertrain Strategy session in Detroit. The room reportedly fell silent. Then came the final blow. "You realize this can't continue, right?" said Chevrolet's engine director. Within hours, termination orders were issued. What followed was a complete shutdown of every technical advancement in progress. The aluminum head program, scrapped, despite passing early tests. The Bosch-based EFI system, shelved, years ahead of similar American systems. Even basic upgrades like roller lifters were blocked. GM didn't just stop development, they buried it. Sabotage by strategy. When you look at what the Holden 308 was on track to achieve, and what American V8s had become by the mid-1970s, the sabotage becomes impossible to ignore. While US-built engines like the Chevrolet 350 were being strangled by tightening emission rules, dropping to as low as 165 horsepower in the Corvette, Holden's 308 was delivering 240 to 260 horsepower in race trim and meeting tougher Australian emission standards. This wasn't just a good engine, it was a global contender. If allowed to evolve, the 308 could have leapfrogged GM's entire international lineup and placed Holden at the forefront of V8 innovation. But that kind of success would have broken GM's brand hierarchy, and that was unacceptable in Detroit's eyes. So GM executed a quiet, calculated sabotage. They didn't just cut funding, they shut down entire engineering programs. They denied approval for proven upgrades. They blocked EFI systems that had already outperformed American counterparts. They buried lightweight aluminum heads and roller lifter projects, not because they failed, but because they succeeded. The 308 wasn't just catching up, it was about to embarrass its American siblings. And Detroit couldn't let that happen. The corporate playbook was clear. Maintain the prestige of US brands at all costs, even if it meant suffocating your most promising engine in another hemisphere. In the end, emissions regulations, economic shifts, and boardroom politics all worked together to make sure the 308 never got its fair shot. What started as a brilliant local solution became a threat to the corporate order, and that's when the Sabotage became strategic. Was that fair? Did GM do the right thing, or did they kill off something that could have changed V8 history? Let me know in the comments. Innovation ignored, excellence denied. Should Holden have been allowed to challenge America's best? Absolutely. By all measures, engineering, performance, and adaptability, the 308 was ready. But by the late 1970s, global conditions were shifting fast. The 1979 oil crisis sent fuel prices soaring, and tougher emissions laws rolled out across key markets. Australia, typically a step behind the regulatory pace of Europe and the US, was now rushing to catch up. For Holden, this should have been the perfect opportunity to prove what their V8 could do under pressure. And they were ready. Holden engineers had already developed a cutting-edge version of the 308 for the VH Commodore program, featuring a microprocessor-controlled engine management system. It cut emissions by 35% while still producing 302 horsepower, performance that would have embarrassed many American engines of the same era. We had a working prototype with electronic fuel injection and exhaust gas recirculation that met projected 1985 standards, recalled former Holden engineer Craig Watson. But when they submitted the design for approval, the response was devastating. GM had redirected funding to global engine programs that would eventually replace the V8. While Holden scraped by on an engineering budget of just $24 million in 1981, GM was pouring more than $500 million into V8 development for Chevrolet and Cadillac. It was clear. Detroit had already decided Holden's engine didn't fit into the future, no matter how good it was. As if that weren't enough, Australia's weakening dollar in the 1980s made importing parts more expensive than ever. Another reason to double down on local solutions. But GM didn't see it that way. One of Holden's most promising innovations, a lean burn combustion chamber that offered better fuel economy without sacrificing power, was shelved. Instead, GM forced them to adopt off-the-shelf American emissions hardware, designed for completely different engines. We were told to adapt American emissions systems to our engine, said former calibration specialist James Connolly. It was like being handed parts for a Cessna and told to make them work in a helicopter. The mismatched components choked the engine's performance. By 1985, it was clear the 308 wasn't being phased out for technical reasons. It was being buried by decisions made half a world away. A legacy buried, but not forgotten. Even after proving they could meet tough emission standards with their own innovations, Holden was ordered to phase out the 308. The replacement? Imported engines like the Buick-sourced 3.8-liter V6, and later the Chevrolet 5.7-liter V8. These weren't upgrades. They were compromises. They cost more to bring in, required extensive re-engineering to suit Australian conditions, and worst of all, they lacked the soul that connected local drivers to Holden's homegrown V8. Ironically, many of these imports suffered from the very issues Holden engineers had already solved years earlier. Before the curtain finally closed, the Commodore VN's fuel-injected 5.0-liter 308 delivered one last standout performance. Despite a shoestring development budget, it outperformed the imported 5.7-liter Chevy V8 in both fuel economy and emissions. It was the final reminder of what Australia had built and what was lost. The story of the Holden 308 isn't just a chapter in automotive history. It's a warning. It shows what happens when corporate politics override technical excellence, when local innovation is sacrificed in favor of global branding strategy. The death of the 308 mirrored the slow decline of Australia's car manufacturing industry itself. Once you see how GM systematically undercut its own Australian engineers, the very team that built one of the most capable V8s of the era, you begin to recognize a familiar pattern. The 308 wasn't killed by emissions or engineering failure. It was buried by boardroom decisions made thousands of miles away by people more focused on protecting American prestige than recognizing Australian brilliance. The story of Holdens' 308 V8 engine is more than a tale of lost potential. It's a powerful reminder of what happens when local innovation clashes with global corporate agendas. This wasn't just an engine. It was a symbol of Australian ingenuity, silenced not by failure, but by fear of success. If you want to hear more stories about the cars and engines that corporations tried to erase from history, stick with us. We're just getting started. Like, share, and subscribe to Classic Car Archive so you never miss the next buried legend we bring back to life.